Welcome back to the third and final part of our Reconstruction video series. Now we're going to talk about some of the negatives of Reconstruction, some of the things where the plan went wrong. Remember what we started with by saying that, there really were a lot of hard feelings on both sides about this. And there were a lot of Southerners who were very upset with the intrusiveness of the Northern soldiers. They were not supportive of giving African Americans equal rights. Even President Johnson was not supportive of giving African Americans equal rights. A number of things that happened during Reconstruction that were very unpleasant. Remember our Reconstruction amendments where we left off, 13, 14, and 15, free citizens vote. So the 13th freed the slaves, 14 made them citizens, and 15 gave African American males the right to vote. So into this rather volatile situation comes the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. These were former Confederate soldiers and others, but a lot of former Confederate soldiers who terrorized African Americans. They did not want African Americans to have equal rights, specifically the right to vote. So they tried very, very hard to keep African Americans from voting. That way, they could not put African Americans into Congress and elevate their rights. So another negative was sharecropping. And sharecropping was where former slaves, they're back working the plantations. It's similar to slavery. But what happens is African Americans who need work, and remember these black codes, many of them said that you had to work for whites, you couldn't be unemployed, or you could be arrested. So what they did was they agreed that they would work a portion of the plantation for a share of the crop. So many of them wound up in desperate poverty this way because you were indebted to the landowner and you had to buy your seed and your fertilizer. If you could not afford to pay back the landowner for those upfront costs, say there was a drought or insects ate your crop, you owed the landowner. Now you were in debt to the landowner. You could not leave if you were in debt to the landowner. And where would you go? You didn't have much money. They were working on a plantation that they could not leave, living in desperate poverty. So it wound up being essentially slavery all over again. As we mentioned earlier, these black codes were laws passed in the South to limit the rights of African Americans, to limit the rights of blacks. It talked about where you could sit on trains, as the comic cartoon here shows. Many other laws. Basically, before the Civil War, you had the slave codes. And they were rules about what slaves could and couldn't do. And basically what a lot of places did was to simply rewrite the slave codes, and where it said slave, you would just put freedmen or black. It wound up being that the Southerners, the black Southerners, really had much, much fewer rights than white Southerners. And that, again, caused a lot of hard feelings. So what happened to these former generals? So Robert E. Lee, and this one is kind of tough because you wouldn't think so, but Robert E. Lee was never a huge supporter of secession. He didn't think that was going to gain the South anything. And he urged the Southerners to reconcile, to make up with the North. They fought the good fight. It was over. It didn't work. And there was no sense in being, bitter and contrary forever and ever over something that didn't work. So he urged the South, like it or not, we have to reunite with the North and move on. He became the president of Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee University. Certainly, Ulysses S. Grant should be a name you've heard of. He goes on to become elected president in 1868. And he, much more than Johnson, advocated for the rights of freed slaves. What happens at the end of Reconstruction? Well, now you've got the election of 1876. And the Republicans put forth Rutherford B. Hayes and the Democrats Samuel J. Tilden. And the results are very close as far as presidential elections go. A number of these electoral votes were in dispute. So each side claims that they have won the victory. What to do? So Tilden had 184 votes, Hayes had 165 votes, but there were 20 votes, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, that were disputed. So they make it, and that deal was that these Union troops that were occupying the South, they were controlling the election boards. They fixed the election. They made an agreement that says, Hayes, the Republican, we're going to give him the election. And in return for that, these federal troops are going to leave the South. When the federal troops leave the South, that is the end of Reconstruction. There's no one now in the South who is enforcing these equality laws that had been passed during Reconstruction. So the Compromise of 1877 helps Rutherford win the election, and the Democrats regain control of the southern states. Federal troops, as we said, leave the South and return control to the Southern Congress. The age of Reconstruction is now over, and so we start a new era called the Jim Crow South. The KKK and the Southern Democrats are now in control. They start to segregate. Jim Crow is a way in which to find ways to deny the African Americans' rights in the South. So you previously had the black codes, and now you have a specific type of black code that was called the Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws are specific laws to segregation, okay? So black codes were laws that, might be you have to be employed if you're African American. Jim Crow laws were laws specific to segregation. So a black code might say that if a person is mixed between black and another race, you're considered black. Blacks can't have public meetings without a white person present. Blacks can't carry guns unless they're in the military. White men cannot sell alcohol to blacks. Blacks must work for whites. These were examples of the very broad black codes. If you were found to be in non-compliance with these black codes or the Jim Crow laws, or as we said, the KKK was trying to keep freed African Americans from voting, lynching was a thing. It was basically the kidnapping and the hanging of African Americans. So in the Jim Crow South, you saw many examples. We watched for white people only. You had the white and the colored drinking fountains. In the late 1800s, there was a Supreme Court case that challenged this segregation, and they found that in this case called Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate was okay. Segregation was legal as long as the facilities were separate but equal. And you can see certainly from the picture here that they were separate, but they were in fact in no way equal. So that is how Reconstruction ends. We've talked in this third part about some of the downsides, the sharecropping, the KKK, the Jim Crow laws, the black codes, and ultimately the deal between the Republicans and the Democrats that would make Rutherford B. Hayes president, but give the South back into the control of the Democrats. And that is where we are going to leave off today. Thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate it, and I hope that this clarifies some things for you.